Hello, this is Finance 328, and this is a synopsis of Chapter 1. So throughout this course, I will be uploading synopses for each chapter. So if you're taking the class online, this will help you to follow along with the PowerPoints and kind of ascertain the main points in each chapter. So I would suggest the best way to study for this course is to look at the PowerPoints, go over the synopses for each chapter on that I have posted on Moodle, and then read the textbook. The the exams are multiple choice, as you know, predominantly multiple choice, and I use the test bank that comes directly from the book for most of the questions. So in this class, it's really important for you to read the chapters thoroughly to perform well on the exams. But anyway, these synopses should help you. And then if you have any questions, of course, feel free, as I have mentioned before on the syllabus, email me, text me, or call me. All right, so let's take a look at chapter 1, which is just talking about risk in general and the way we treat risk. And so this class and the material in this class is really from two perspectives. The perspective of a company or commercial interests as far as risk management, and then also the perspective of consumers, of us, how we manage risk through insurance and so forth. All right, I'm going to skip these learning objectives and get right to the heart of the matter here. All right, so what is risk? Well, the traditional definition of risk is just uncertainty concerning the occurrence of a loss. So if you think about risk in our personal lives, we have the risk of getting in a car accident, or the risk of something happening to our home. If you rent an apartment, you have the risk of something happening to your personal property. So that's why we would buy homeowners insurance, buy automobile insurance, or if you're a renter, I strongly recommend that you buy renter's insurance. It's very cheap and it protects you if your personal property, something happens to your personal property in the apartment or house that you're renting. Also, it protects you against liability. If somebody comes over to your apartment and gets hurt, the landlord could be sued for liability, but also you could be sued also. So there's some liability there. And then what a lot of people don't realize is if your car is broken into and your personal property is stolen out of your vehicle, that's not covered under the auto policy. That's covered under a homeowner's policy or a renter's policy. So your personal property is covered anywhere you are. However, it's a renter's policy or a homeowner's policy that would cover it. All right, so risk is used to just basically define uncertainty. From an investment perspective, risk, think about if you're investing in the stock market. If you have a 401k plan and you're in various mutual funds, in investment, the risk is the probability of negative returns. So that's how it's defined in investments from an investment perspective. All right, so we have so loss exposure is just any time you're in a situation where a loss is possible. Well, that's pretty much 24/7, every day of our lives. We get in a car, there's risk exposure. Living in our homes or our apartments, we have risk exposure of anything. Lightning could strike, a fire, a break-in, wind damage, hail. So we're surrounded by these risks every day. Now, there's objective risk and there's subjective risk. Now, the insurance companies try to use objective risk whenever they can. Objective risk is when the risk can be quantified. So if I asked you, well, what's the probability of your dwelling catching fire? Or what's the probability of you being in an accident? Well, you might think that's subjective because we don't know when that can happen. Personally, we don't know when that can happen to us. But if you think about over the over the population as a whole, it really is objective risk because the insurance companies can look at a particular zip code, for example. They can look at national figures. They can also look at a zip code. So they can look at Thibodeau 70301, and they can look and see, well, over the years, how many fires have there been? How many break-ins have there been? And these kinds of things. And so they can really break it down, and it is objective risk. So they know X percentage of, with fairly, they can be fairly certain that X percentage of dwellings are going to have a fire. There's going to be X percentage of break-ins in a particular area. And so they use those statistics to calculate the premiums that we pay. And think about life insurance. Life insurance, it's pretty much all objective. They look at the mortality rates, and then they ask us all sorts of questions. If you're going to get a life insurance policy, they're going to ask you all kinds of questions to better evaluate the risk to charge you a specific premium. So they're going to ask you things like if you're a smoker, how much you drink, do you scuba dive, do you skydive, what's your profession. They're going to look and see if you take prescription drugs. They'll also do a urine and a blood test. And so they're getting all of this information to try to calculate the risk and to see when you're going to die or how much of a risk you are. Of course, we don't know when we're going to die, but they try to see the probability of you living a long life. And the lower the risk, of course, the lower the premium. All right, so that's objective risk. Subjective risk is when there's some uncertainty. The best example I can think of with subjective risk is investments. If a company's investing, or if you're investing as an individual, and you can look at the financial data of the company, you can look at all this math, all these numbers, but there's a lot of subjectivity also that goes into trying to figure out what the price of a stock is going to be and if it's going to go up or go down. So that would be an example of subjective risk. So if you don't have the numbers for something, hard data, then it would be subjective. So think about COVID. We didn't really have any stats on COVID when COVID hit. And so a lot of the perceived risk or a lot of these forecasts were subjective. All right, next slide here. Okay, so the chance of loss is simply the probability that a loss will occur. And then you can calculate the probability of a loss occurring. And so you can, for example, going back to fires. In a community, you can figure out the probability that a fire is going to occur. Or what's the probability of this house catching fire? And then you can calculate the standard deviation, and you can calculate what we call objective probability. So maybe there's a 1% chance that on any given year, the house is going to catch fire. That's subjective probability. Subjective probability is just your own personal estimate of what you think is going to happen. So, of course, insurance companies, they like objective probability because it's easy to quantify what the premiums should be. Okay, so here, this is the chance of an example of a chance of loss. So here we have a situation where in Philadelphia, you've got two cities, all right? They're looking at 10,000 homes, and they have the objective risk. They figured out the chance of loss, the objective probability is there's a 1% chance of a fire happening, and there's 100 fires each year. But look at the range here. So we're talking about, this is just an easy way of talking about the standard deviation. So if you should have taken QBA 282 by now. So you should remember the mean, the average, and the standard deviation. The mean is the average or the expected value is the average, and then the standard deviation is the variation from the mean. And so that's kind of like the range, and similar to the range. So anyway, look at Philadelphia. The range is ranging from 75 fires a year to 125 a year. Whereas in LA, the range is just from 90 to 110. So even though this is still, the chance is 1%, the objective risk in Philadelphia is much higher than the objective risk in Los Angeles. So we would expect to see lower premiums in Los Angeles as a result of the objective risk numbers. Okay, so the rest of this chapter is basically just dealing with terms, some terms and definitions. So we're going to go over those. Okay, so what is a peril? A peril is simply the cause of the loss. So if your house burns down, the peril is a fire. If your shingles come off due to a windstorm, that's the peril is a windstorm. If you have lightning damage, the peril is lightning. Damage to your car because of a collision with another vehicle, the peril is collision. All right, so the peril is just what causes the damage. A hazard is a condition that increases the frequency or the severity of a loss. So a physical hazard is a condition that would increase something happening, increase the severity or the frequency of the loss. So for example, if you have loose shingles on your roof, that's a physical hazard that's going to increase the chances of having water come into your house. If you have a broken window, for example, or something is in ill repair, that's a physical hazard. A moral hazard is basically something that causes you to behave in a manner that would increase the frequency or severity of a loss. So if you say, well, I have car insurance, so I can drive as reckless as I want. And so because I have insurance, I'm going to drive 80 miles an hour instead of 65 or 70. That would be an example of a moral hazard. Or if you have health insurance, and so you're going to be covered if something happens, so you behave in a more and you're not as cautious in your behavior because you have health insurance. So you smoking and drinking, what have you. So any type of behavior that makes it more likely that you would that something would happen is considered a moral hazard. And so another example, let's say that I have renter's insurance, and I leave my apartment, and on the way to school I realize, oh, I forgot to lock the door. And so if I didn't have insurance, I would go back and lock the door. But since I have insurance, I'm saying, well, I'm not going to bother to go all the way back there, because what are the chances of my apartment being broken into? And anyway, if it is broken into, I have insurance. So we've just increased the probability of something happening. You've increased the probability of a loss on the insurance company because you didn't go back to lock the door because you had insurance. You knew you'd be covered. That's a moral hazard. All right. And then they talk about these different attitudinal hazards and legal hazards, just little subsets of moral hazard. Okay, now there's two types of risk, the way the industry classifies risk: pure risk and speculative risk. So this is what's important to remember with this. With pure risk, there's only two outcomes, either a loss or no loss. We can't profit from the insurance company. They'll either make us whole again, or if we don't have a loss, we don't have a loss. So with insurance, it's pure risk. You either have a loss or you don't have a loss. So you think about earthquake, fire, hurricane, theft, what have you, either a loss or no loss. Speculative risk is a situation where you can have three outcomes. You can either have a profit, a loss, or no loss. So they talk about gambling here. You can get your money back with gambling. You can make a profit, or you can have a loss. I would have put investing instead of gambling. So think about investing. If you invest in the stock market, for example, of course, your returns are not guaranteed. You've got three outcomes. With investing, you either make money, you lose money, or you don't make anything. So speculative risk is 3 outcomes, um, pure risk 2 outcomes. Okay, then we have diversifiable and non-diversifiable risk. So diversifiable risk is basically can be eliminated by diversification. So what they're saying here is when you think about insurance, the insurance companies, they only cover perils that can be diversified. All right. So, and we're going to get into something called the law of large numbers. So the way insurance works is you have these perils, and by peril I mean theft, fire, um, hurricane, wind, which is wind. That a hurricane is wind, hail, um, what else? Oh, tornado. All those things in private insurance companies cover for our homes. And the reason they do that is because they cover a wide range of people. They've diversified by, let's just take State Farm, for example. State Farm insurance is available throughout the entire US. So they're covering homeowners throughout the entire US. Well, if a hurricane hits, or if a tornado hits, or if there's a fire, it only affects a small group of individuals. So they've diversified the risk away. It's not going to break the company if there's a hurricane in Louisiana or Mississippi, because that's just a small segment of their customers. So that's what we mean by diversifiable risk. Non-diversifiable risk is risk that affects the entire group or the entire economy. Now they have hurricane in here, which they really shouldn't have, because you can get hurricane coverage for the most part through private insurers. Now, there's a caveat to that. As you know, if you live on the coast, you probably can't get hurricane coverage through a private insurer. You have to go through the government, through the state government. But let's not use hurricane. Let's use flood, because that's a better example. So what the insurance company has decided is that if there's a flood, that's something that's catastrophic. Normally when there's a flood, it affects vast communities, much more than a hurricane. So because floods are so widespread and so catastrophic, you can't diversify that away. It affects too many people. So that's why you cannot get flood insurance through a private insurer. The flood insurance is subsidized through the federal government, and that's because it's a non-diversifiable risk. Also, if you think about Social Security, that's federally funded insurance, basically. That's because it's non-diversifiable. Okay, and now I'm going to flip the coin here and talk about investments, because that is risk too, even though it's not insurance. This class is about risk. So when you're investing, if you diversify your investments over a broad range of asset classes, in other words, let's say I had a portfolio and I was going to buy mutual funds. Well, if I buy mutual funds, and those of you who don't know, a mutual fund is just a company that buys a bunch of different stocks in a bunch of different areas and pools people's money. So you can buy a mutual fund and you're diversified. But let's just say I was buying individual stocks. Well, I would go out maybe and buy ExxonMobil, Chevron, some Johnson. So I'm in oil, energy. Buy some Johnson and Johnson, maybe some Pfizer to be in pharmaceuticals, get some Walmart to be in retail. I would buy McDonald's or Starbucks, restaurant. So you get the idea. I would buy all kinds of different stocks in different areas to be diversified. And so that would eliminate my diversifiable risk, the risk of one stock going up or down, going down too much. But I also have non-diversifiable risk. So in the investment world, non-diversifiable risk is also called systematic risk. So think of risk of the whole system. So if we have, like COVID was a perfect example. COVID was a non-diversifiable risk. It affected the whole market. If the economy goes into a recession, that's a non-diversifiable risk. A terrorist attack would be a non-diversifiable risk. All right, so you get the picture here with diversifiable, hopefully, versus non-diversifiable. Okay, then they classify, we further will classify risk. All right, so we've classified it from diversifiable and non-diversifiable, and then we're going to go a little bit deeper and talk about this is basically, and from a commercial point of view, enterprise risk is just all of the risk that a company is faced with. All right, so then we can break down enterprise risk to strategic risk. Well, that's the risk regarding the firm's financial goals and objectives. Okay, so maybe they had goals to get into a certain you know to they had a goal of what they knew what their strategic market was and what the objectives were, and maybe because of consumer changes in tastes, they're having to change those goals. So maybe, various reasons like demographics, let's say the aging of America, or people just changing their taste, they're going to have to shift their goals a little bit. So think about McDonald's. McDonald's had a goal, and those goals and objectives have probably changed over the years as people have tried to eat more healthy. And so that would be an example of strategic risk. Operational risk is the results from the business operations. So, COVID created a lot of operational risk for firms, I would say, because of all the issues with COVID, and companies have had trouble getting supplies from a lot of their suppliers due to COVID. So any interruption in the operation would be operational risk. Financial risk refers to problems with their finances. Okay, so for example, if you are a restaurant, commodity prices are a big thing. What if the price of food goes up? The price of corn and wheat and stuff and such goes up. That's a big risk. Interest rate risk. If interest rates go up, it makes it more expensive for companies to do business. Foreign exchange rate risk, and so forth. So, for example, let me give you a couple of examples. Southwest Airlines and the airline industry. What's their biggest risk as far as their inputs? That would affect their income statement. Well, it would be the price of fuel. So what they do is they will buy these futures contracts that will set the price of fuel for them. So typically oil's going up and not down, right? So if they don't want to have this shock where they're just going along fine with their business, and all of a sudden the price of fuel goes up, they will enter into these contracts where they're guaranteed a certain price. And that can save them a lot of money if the price of jet fuel goes up. Of course, they've paid for this. It's cost them money to enter into these. They're called futures contracts. If the price of oil or the price of fuel goes down, which it has been in the past, then they really didn't have to undertake enter into those contracts. They've actually kind of lost a little bit of money, but it's basically like an insurance policy. It reduces their risk because they know once they buy a contract, they can get fuel at a certain price. Also, foreign exchange rates. Companies doing business overseas, this can be a problem. So think about the strong dollar. When the dollar increases in value, that's really good for us as consumers, right? Because it makes imported goods cheaper. Or if we want to go down to Mexico, the dollar's worth a lot more. It's just the opposite, of course, for people coming to the U.S. It's more expensive to come to the U.S., or it makes our exports more expensive. But think about a company. So with a company, if you're sending your products to Mexico, and the profits are in pesos, then if the dollar is strong against the peso, if the dollar is rising against the pesos, that's reducing your profits over there. Because when you have to convert your profits from pesos into dollars, you're not getting as much money as you once would. So what companies will do is they'll buy these contracts, just like Southwest does with fuel. Companies will enter into these contracts that will guarantee them a certain exchange rate, and that protects them against this foreign exchange rate risk. Okay, so those are just a few examples. All right, so companies they'll have this enterprise risk management. I gave you some examples on the prior slide, so where they try to minimize their enterprise risk. Let me go back to operational risk and give you a few examples there. One thing that companies learned the hard way through Katrina down here was that you shouldn't have suppliers in the same location, or you shouldn't just have one supplier. Like, companies that had suppliers in New Orleans. For example, there was a bar in downtown Thibodaux. And I was asking one of my students, how are things going after Katrina? And he said, well, we can't get any supplies in because our supplier was in New Orleans. And so companies learn the hard way. Don't have just one supplier. You need to have more than one supplier, and probably in different areas. Also, some companies would have their backup data only in one location. That's, you need to have duplication to reduce your operational risk. So that's just one example of enterprise risk management regarding the operational risk. I already talked about some examples for the financial risk. So here they're just talking about with financial risks, financial derivatives, that's the contracts I was talking about, buying into these futures contracts. Derivatives and futures contracts, very similar. Or they can hedge. There's these hedging techniques where you can buy two different types of assets, where if one goes up, the other's going down, and so forth. And that will help you to minimize your risk. For example, if you wanted to diversify, you wouldn't buy Chevron and Exxon Mobil, right? Because those are either going to be up at the same time or down at the same time. As an investor, you would probably buy, you'd buy an oil company, and then you'd buy something else that would try to go in the opposite direction. For example, just to think of a company, Dollar Tree, or the Dollar General. Dollar General, when we had our last big recession, 2007 to 2009, Dollar General actually was up because, of course, people were going there to shop because it was cheap. So that's an example of a company that you could invest in that has a complete opposite reaction of most other stocks. So that would be an example of a hedging technique. Okay, then remember systematic risk. That's the same thing as non-diversifiable risk. It's the, a recession, a terrorist attack, COVID, things that just where everything goes down, you can't diversify that away. Okay, so we talked about, the enterprise risk, of course, deals with companies, is commercial risk. So let's talk about the major personal and commercial risks that we face. Okay, so these are personal risks. What risks do we face? Well, premature death, of course. So we would buy life insurance to take care of our family, our dependents, in case we should die early. So that's what life insurance is for. Retirement risks. You don't know what's going to happen in retirement. You want to be financially set, hopefully, in retirement, and not run out of money before you die. So, and that's a real issue in this country, because people are living longer due to healthier lifestyles and technology that has increased. We've had all these advances in the medical field, advances in medicines and so forth, and treatments, and we're living longer, but people don't seem to save enough for retirement. So there is a real risk of people running out of money before they die, which is a depressing thought, and also the risk of not having enough, just not having enough money, not running out, but not having enough, not having the lifestyle that you want. All right, and then we also have poor health is another issue we face with. So it's good to have health insurance. Oh, back to this retirement risk. You want to save for retirement, have a retirement plan, have with your company, hopefully, maybe invest in an individual retirement plan and so forth. Unemployment is a risk. We do have federally funded unemployment for that, but we can also save, have our personal savings. And then drug and alcohol addiction. I don't know why they even put that in here, honestly, but yeah, that's a risk. I mean, I'm sure there's probably not a family out there that can say, oh, I don't have any relatives who have had a drinking problem. I think all of us probably have relatives who have drinking problems, and unfortunately probably drug addiction too. You know the toll it takes. And of course there's treatments for that, but as you know, as some of you may know, it's difficult to treat addiction. All right. So what is the difference between these are property risks. What's the difference between a direct loss or an indirect loss? Well, a direct loss is the loss as a result of the peril. So if your house catches fire, that's the direct loss. You had damage because of a fire. If there's a windstorm and you get a roof leak, a wind and rainstorm and you have a roof leak, that's the damage. The direct loss is as a result of the wind. The indirect loss is the loss that's indirect, that results indirectly from that peril. So for example, my house catches fire, it's damaged. That's the direct loss. The indirect loss is that the insurance company is paying for me to live in an apartment or a hotel for the next 6 months. That's the indirect loss. All right. Okay. Liability risks. So there are a lot of any insurance policy that you have, be it personal or commercial, has liability. That means if you're with your auto insurance, if you hit somebody, that would be liability. They would cover the bodily injury and such for the person that you hit, and cover loss of wages up to the limits of the policy. If somebody slips and falls in your house, that's liability. They would cover their medical payments and loss of wages. And if you were sued, they would cover you up to the limits of the policy. So that's what we mean by liability. And of course, commercial policies have this too. These are the major types of personal and commercial risks. Property risks, of course, damage to buildings. Liability risks, as we already mentioned, suits for a company, it could be defective products. For a personal risk, it's somebody falling at your house or you hitting a pedestrian in your car. But if you think about from a commercial issue, defective products, it could be somebody falling in your store, but it also could be defective products. You could be sued for pollution if people are catching cancer where your plant is, or getting cancer because of pollution. And then this is, think about the world we're living in today. Sexual harassment, any type of discrimination or sexual harassment is really kind of at the forefront today. So that's a big liability for companies. And so, one thing they might do is have training programs to try to prevent this. Okay, loss of business income if something happens and the company has to shut down. And then cybersecurity and identity theft, big deal for us, and also for companies. So they've got these, their companies' computers can be hacked, they can get personal information, and then companies are liable to make us whole again if we're compromised. And then for us, just in our personal lives, we can have identity theft. Now your homeowner's policy will cover this cybersecurity and identity theft up to a limit. It's usually a small limit on the policy, usually $1,000 or $2,000. Okay, here's some other major risks. This is mainly dealing with personal risk. So human resource exposures, job-related injuries. I would also tie this back to the liability risk with discrimination or sexual harassment too, this human resource exposures. You can have, if you're dealing with other countries or in this country, you can have terrorist issues. Let's see. Oh, you can have damage to your reputation or public image. There could be, let me think of an example. Oh, you may not remember this, but about 10 years ago, Lululemon, y'all familiar with Lululemon? Well, their stock went down quite a bit and they were being sued because they they sold these leggings, and when you ran and perspired and the leggings got wet, they became transparent. So that was a real public image issue for Lululemon. That's just one example. All right, government exposure, safety violations, and so forth. Okay, so what's the burden of risk on society? Well, it can be expensive for society if if we have these large unexpected losses. Just think about COVID. What's the burden of society on COVID? Well, the government's spending an inordinate amount of money for the vaccines, stimulus money, that we're all going to have to pay that eventually. And it maybe our kids, maybe my grandkids or your kids, we're going to be paying that in higher taxes. So there is, this, and the rise of these lawsuits, it means higher premiums for us. So there are burdens of risk on society. This is, what are the techniques for managing risk? Well, you can try to control the risk, which is just reduce the frequency or the severity of the losses. Avoidance was one thing. So for example, if you go down to Grand Isle, if you buy a camp down in Grand Isle, you're going to have a difficult time getting a wind policy from a private insurer. They're just avoiding that area altogether. That would be an example of avoidance. Or a lot of times if you also, I'll pick on Grand Isle again, there's not a lot of commercial development down there because you don't see a McDonald's or Wendy's. You don't see a lot of chains down there, probably because of the population is not as large down there, but also because of the risk of the geographical location. Also in high crime areas, portions of cities with high crime, you're going to see some businesses just avoiding it. So you can avoid it. You can just do risk avoidance. You can also prevent loss prevention. Example of that would be, if you're trying to prevent sexual harassment and discrimination, for example, you can try to educate your employees. If they also have safety classes to try to prevent accidents and accidents happening on the job. That would be another example of loss prevention. And then can you reduce loss? Well, duplication, separation, diversification. And I've given you multiple examples of how companies can duplicate, have separation, or diversify. So they could, have different suppliers, for example, different locations of these suppliers. So this is all ways that you can prevent yourself from having to pay premiums for insurance by managing your risk. All right, some companies will decide to, instead of buying insurance, they're just going to pay for it themselves. So these are examples of retention, where they're just going to retain the losses that might result. That's just a fancy way of saying they're going to pay for it themselves. Some companies will self-insure. If a company is large enough, they don't have to pay for insurance. They don't have to pay insurance premiums. They can self-insure, and they might set up a whole separate department that isn't where they're paying premiums into this special fund as a form of self-insurance. Other ways that companies will they'll transfer the risk. Instead of buying insurance or self-insuring, they'll transfer the risk to us. Here is a typical way that it's done. It's called a hold harmless agreement. So if you've ever taken your kids to one of those trampoline parks, you have to sign away your life before your kid can jump on the trampoline. Well, that's a hold harmless agreement. Water park, you could buy a ticket to a water park, you're going to sign some kind of hold harmless agreement so that if you get injured there, you can't sue them. I talked about hedging before. Some companies will incorporate. That reduces that's a form of business organization. Instead of being a sole proprietorship, you can incorporate, and that will that limits your losses. So with a corporation, the liability is limited to whatever you've invested. So if you're a shareholder in the corporation and they get sued and go under, you're not going to be liable for any lawsuits. You're just going to lose the money that you have invested. So there's limited liability with incorporating. Okay, and then I mentioned this before. Insurance works for most people. It's practical because it's a risk transfer. You're transferring the risk to the insurance company, and the insurance company has many customers, so they're pooling the risk. So they're able to charge us relatively low premiums for the risk. So, if our house was destroyed by fire and we had no insurance, might cost us $150,000, depending on how nice of a house we have. But let's just say it might cost us minimum, let's say typical house, to rebuild the house, $100,000. Well, we don't have that kind of money lying around, but we can pay between $1,000 and $2,000 a year for insurance to prevent that catastrophe from happening. And so the law of large numbers reduces the premiums. Okay, so this is it for chapter 1. Hope you enjoyed the synopsis. I tried to make it brief because I know it's difficult to sit there for a long period of time listening to me or watching these PowerPoints. So as I said, I'll continue to do this throughout the book, and the best way to study, just to repeat, go over the PowerPoints, listen to the synopsis, and then that'll give you some ideas of what are the main points in the textbook when you read the chapters. And make sure in this class that you read all the chapters thoroughly, because it will really help you when you're taking the exams. Okay, goodbye for now.